The moment I pressed send on that text message to Dr. Richardson, I knew there was no going back. My hands were shaking as I typed the words that would finally expose the truth about my mother's so-called terminal diagnosis. 27 years of manipulation, lies, and emotional blackmail were about to come crashing down around her perfectly manicured world. I had no idea that single message would not only destroy the carefully constructed image she'd built in our small Tennessee town, but would also reveal a web of deception so deep that even I, her own daughter, had been fooled for months. The woman who had taught me that family always comes first was about to learn that sometimes the truth comes first, even when it shatters everything you thought you knew about the person who raised you. My mother, Patricia Caldwell, had always been the center of attention wherever she went. Growing up in Knoxville, she was the kind of woman who commanded every room she entered, with her perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move even in the strongest Tennessee winds, and her collection of pastel cardigans that she coordinated with her mood and the season. She volunteered at our Methodist church every Sunday, organized the annual charity bake sale, and somehow managed to make every conversation about herself while appearing completely selfless to everyone around her. I spent my childhood watching her perform this elaborate dance of martyrdom, always the victim, always suffering more than anyone else, always deserving of sympathy and attention. But it wasn't until I turned 32 and moved back home to help care for her during her battle with stage 4 pancreatic cancer that I realized just how deep her need for attention really went. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, just as the leaves were starting to turn those brilliant shades of orange and red that make Tennessee autumns so beautiful. I was in my apartment in Nashville, getting ready for another day at the marketing firm where I'd been building my career for the past 8 years, when my phone rang with that familiar ringtone I'd assigned to Mom. Her voice was weak, trembling in a way I'd never heard before, as she whispered the words that would change everything. "Sweetheart, I need you to come home. The doctors found something." The way she said it, with that perfect combination of bravery and vulnerability, made my heart stop. This was my mother, the woman who had raised me single-handedly after Dad died when I was 12, who had worked 2 jobs to put me through college, who had been my rock through every heartbreak and disappointment. The thought of losing her felt like the ground was opening up beneath my feet. Within a week, I had quit my job, packed up my life in Nashville, and moved back into my childhood bedroom in Mom's house on Maple Street. The room still had the same pink wallpaper with tiny roses that she'd chosen when I was 8, and the same white furniture that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in a dollhouse. But coming home wasn't about nostalgia. It was about making sure my mother didn't have to face cancer alone. She had told me the diagnosis was terminal, that she had maybe 6 months if she was lucky, and that she wanted to spend her remaining time surrounded by family and the community that had supported her for so many years. I threw myself into the role of caregiver with the same determination I'd brought to every other challenge in my life, determined to make her last months as comfortable and meaningful as possible. The first few weeks back home were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, prescription pickups, and endless conversations with concerned church members who wanted to know how they could help. Mom had already started chemotherapy, and she handled it with the same grace and strength that had carried her through Dad's death and all the other challenges life had thrown at her. She would sit in her favorite recliner, wrapped in the hand-knitted afghan that Mrs. Henderson from church had made her, looking pale but determined as she talked about her treatment plan and her hopes for beating the odds. The whole congregation rallied around her, bringing casseroles and flowers, offering to drive her to appointments, and including her in their daily prayers. Watching our community come together to support her filled me with a warmth and gratitude that reminded me why I'd always loved small-town life, even when I thought I'd outgrown it. But as the weeks turned into months, something started to feel off. Mom's energy levels seemed to fluctuate in ways that didn't match what I'd researched about pancreatic cancer and chemotherapy. Some days she'd be bedridden, barely able to lift her head from the pillow, dramatically whispering that she didn't think she could go on much longer. But then, on days when she had church events or social gatherings, she'd suddenly find the strength to get dressed up, put on makeup, and hold court as the brave cancer warrior who was inspiring everyone with her positive attitude. I told myself that everyone handles illness differently, that maybe the adrenaline of being around people gave her temporary boosts of energy. But deep down, a tiny voice in the back of my mind kept asking questions I didn't want to acknowledge, questions that made me feel guilty for even thinking them about my own mother. The first red flag should have been the medical bills, or rather, the lack of them. I had offered to handle all of Mom's finances while she focused on getting better, and I'd been prepared for the crushing weight of medical debt that comes with cancer treatment in America. I'd researched insurance coverage, looked into payment plans, and even started a GoFundMe page that raised over $15,000 from our community and my college friends. But when I sat down to organize her medical expenses, I found something strange. The bills from her oncologist were there, along with prescription receipts for what looked like standard chemotherapy medications, but something about the amounts didn't add up. The treatments she described as grueling, intensive sessions that left her weak for days were being billed as routine consultations. When I asked her about it, she waved me off with that dismissive gesture I remembered from childhood, telling me that her insurance was better than I thought and that I shouldn't worry about such things when she was fighting for her life. The second red flag came during Thanksgiving dinner, when the whole extended family gathered at our house for what we all believed might be Mom's last holiday with us. She had insisted on cooking the entire meal herself, despite my protests that she should rest and let me handle everything. I watched her spend 3 days preparing a feast that could have fed 20 people, moving around the kitchen with an energy and stamina that seemed impossible for someone undergoing aggressive chemotherapy. She lifted the heavy turkey in and out of the oven, spent hours on her feet making homemade stuffing and cranberry sauce, and even decorated the dining room with elaborate fall centerpieces she'd crafted herself. When I suggested she might be overdoing it, she clutched her chest dramatically and said, "Honey, this might be my last Thanksgiving. I want to make it special for everyone." But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't acting like someone who was dying. She was acting like someone who was performing the role of someone who was dying. The third red flag was the most disturbing of all, and it involved my 8-year-old niece, Emma. My brother Jake had driven down from Louisville with his family, and Emma had always been especially close to her grandmother. During the visit, I overheard Mom coaching Emma on how to act around her very sick grandmother, telling her to speak softly, not to run around too much because it would tire Grandma out, and to give extra gentle hugs because Grandma was fragile. But then I watched Mom pick Emma up and spin her around in the backyard, laughing and playing with the kind of vigor that contradicted everything she'd just told the child about being careful. When Emma innocently asked why Grandma seemed so much stronger when they were alone, Mom quickly changed the subject and sent her inside to wash her hands. The look of confusion on Emma's face haunted me for days afterward, because it was the same confusion I'd been feeling, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. It was during the Christmas season that my suspicions really began to crystallize into something I couldn't ignore. Mom had volunteered to organize the church's annual Christmas pageant, a massive undertaking that involved coordinating costumes, directing rehearsals, and managing dozens of children and their parents. I begged her to step down from the responsibility, reminding her that she was supposed to be conserving her energy for treatment. But she insisted that the pageant was her legacy, her final gift to the church community that had given her so much over the years. I watched her work 12-hour days, barking orders at volunteers, hauling heavy set pieces around the church basement, and staying up until midnight hand-sewing angel costumes. This was not the behavior of a woman who was dying of pancreatic cancer. This was the behavior of a woman who was thriving on the attention and sympathy her illness was bringing her. The breaking point came on New Year's Eve, when Mom announced that she wanted to throw a party to celebrate making it through another year against all odds. She spent weeks planning an elaborate gathering, inviting everyone from church, all the neighbors, and family members from 3 states away. She hired a caterer, rented a tent for the backyard, and even booked a local band to play her favorite songs from the 60s. As I watched her dance the night away, laughing and socializing until well past midnight, I realized that I had reached my limit. This woman, who had been supposedly fighting for her life for the past 4 months, had more energy and vitality than I did. She was glowing with happiness, basking in the attention and love that her brave battle had brought her, and I finally understood what my gut had been trying to tell me all along. The next morning, as I sat in my childhood bedroom staring at the pink rosebuds on the wallpaper, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to call Dr. Richardson's office and ask some very direct questions about my mother's treatment plan and prognosis. I told myself I was just being a responsible daughter, making sure I understood the medical situation so I could better care for her. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line that would either confirm my worst fears or force me to confront the possibility that I had become suspicious of my own dying mother. Either way, I couldn't continue living in this state of doubt and confusion. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt to discover it. The phone call I made that Tuesday morning in January would haunt me for the rest of my life, but not for the reasons I expected. When I called Dr. Richardson's office, I was prepared for a conversation about treatment options, survival rates, and how to make my mother's remaining time as comfortable as possible. What I wasn't prepared for was the long pause that followed when I identified myself as Patricia Caldwell's daughter and asked about her chemotherapy schedule. The receptionist, Mrs. Garcia, whom I'd met several times in the waiting room, cleared her throat awkwardly before saying, "Honey, I think you need to speak directly with Dr. Richardson about this. Can you hold while I see if he's available?" The tone in her voice sent ice through my veins. It wasn't the gentle sympathy I'd grown accustomed to hearing from medical professionals. It was something else entirely, something that sounded dangerously close to pity mixed with concern. Dr. Richardson came on the line within minutes, and his voice carried a weight that immediately told me my world was about to shift off its axis. "I'm glad you called," he said, and those 4 words contained more meaning than I was ready to process. "I've been hoping to have a conversation with you about your mother's care. Can you come in this afternoon? I think it would be better if we discussed this in person." The professional distance in his voice was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like relief, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for months. I agreed to meet him at 3 o'clock, and as I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the end call button. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever Dr. Richardson was going to tell me would change everything I thought I knew about my mother's illness. The drive to Dr. Richardson's office felt like traveling through a fog of unreality. I passed the familiar landmarks of my childhood, the elementary school where Mom had volunteered as a reading tutor, the park where she'd taught me to ride a bike, the ice cream shop where she'd taken me after every dental appointment to celebrate my bravery. These were the foundations of my relationship with her, built on memories of a woman who had been loving, supportive, and present through every important moment of my life. How could that same woman be capable of the deception I was beginning to suspect? As I sat in the parking lot outside the medical building, staring at the sign that read Richardson Oncology Associates, I felt like I was about to betray not just my mother, but every good memory I had of our relationship. Dr. Richardson's office smelled like antiseptic and artificial air freshener, a combination that had become sickeningly familiar over the past few months. But this time, instead of sitting in the waiting room with Mom, holding her hand and whispering encouraging words, I was alone, about to have a conversation that could destroy everything I believed about the woman who raised me. Dr. Richardson was a kind man in his 60s, with gray hair and the sort of gentle manner that made even the worst news seem bearable. He had been Mom's oncologist for what I believed were 4 intense months of treatment, and I had watched him deliver updates on her condition with the careful compassion of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate terminal diagnoses. But as he gestured for me to sit down in the chair across from his desk, his expression was unlike anything I'd seen from him before. "Your mother," he began slowly, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield, "has been a patient of mine for several months now. But I need you to understand that her treatment plan has been unusual." He paused, studying my face as if trying to gauge how much truth I could handle at once. "Patricia came to me in October with concerns about some abdominal pain she'd been experiencing. We ran a full battery of tests, including CT scans, blood work, and even a biopsy. The results showed some minor inflammation, likely related to stress or dietary issues, but absolutely no signs of cancer." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with the force of a revelation that I had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. I felt my carefully constructed understanding of the past 4 months crumbling around me like a house of cards in a strong wind. Dr. Richardson continued, his voice growing more concerned as he watched the color drain from my face. "When I gave your mother the good news that she was cancer-free, I expected relief, maybe tears of joy. Instead, she became agitated and insisted that I must have made a mistake, that she could feel the cancer growing inside her. She demanded more tests, additional scans, consultations with specialists. I've been trying to convince her for months that she's healthy, but she keeps returning, asking for treatments she doesn't need, medications that would be harmful to someone without cancer." He leaned forward, his eyes filled with the kind of professional concern that told me he'd been wrestling with this situation for far longer than I had. "I've been in practice for 35 years, and I've never encountered a case quite like this. Your mother appears to have convinced herself that she has a terminal illness, and more concerning, she seems to have convinced everyone around her as well." The room started spinning as the full weight of what he was telling me settled in. My mother didn't have cancer. She had never had cancer. For 4 months, I had restructured my entire life around caring for a woman who was perfectly healthy but had somehow convinced herself and everyone else that she was dying. The community support, the fundraising, the tearful conversations about making memories while we still could, the way she had manipulated Emma and the rest of our family into treating her like a fragile, dying saint, it had all been based on a lie. But was it a conscious lie, or had she genuinely deluded herself into believing she was sick? As I sat in that sterile office, trying to process information that felt too surreal to be true, I realized that the answer to that question would determine not just what I did next, but whether I could ever trust my mother again. I drove home from Dr. Richardson's office in a state of shock so profound that I'm still amazed I made it safely down those familiar Tennessee roads. My mind was racing through every interaction I'd had with Mom over the past 4 months, re-examining every tearful conversation, every moment of weakness, every time she'd played the brave victim facing death with dignity. The woman I thought I was caring for didn't exist. The terminal diagnosis that had brought our entire community together in support was a fantasy. The GoFundMe money, the casseroles, the prayer circles, the way everyone had rallied around our family during this difficult time, it was all based on a lie so elaborate and sustained that I couldn't comprehend how she had maintained it for so long. But as I pulled into our driveway and saw her silhouette in the kitchen window, probably preparing another performance of brave suffering, I knew I had to confront her immediately. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, wearing her favorite lavender cardigan and looking through a stack of get-well cards that had arrived in the mail. She looked up at me with that practiced expression of weary bravery that I now realized was completely fabricated, and asked in her carefully modulated weak voice, "How was your day, sweetheart? You look upset. You're not worried about me, are you?" The casual way she delivered that question, the slight tilt of her head that suggested maternal concern mixed with resigned acceptance of her fate, made my blood pressure spike to levels I didn't know were possible. Here she was, still performing, still manipulating, even after months of putting our entire family through emotional hell based on a complete fiction. "I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Richardson today," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my hands were trembling with a combination of rage and disbelief. I watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of panic, guilt, or recognition of what was coming. Instead, she just smiled that patient, martyred smile and said, "Oh, that's nice, dear. I hope he didn't worry you with too many medical details. You know how doctors can be with all their technical talk." Her complete lack of reaction told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a case of self-delusion or psychological breakdown. This was a calculated, deliberate deception that she had been maintaining with the skill of a professional actress. "He told me you don't have cancer, Mom. He told me you've never had cancer. He told me that for 4 months. He's been trying to convince you that you're perfectly healthy, but you keep demanding treatments for an illness you don't have." The words came out of my mouth like bullets, each one aimed directly at the facade she had been maintaining for so long. I expected tears, denials, explanations, maybe even anger at being caught. What I didn't expect was the look of cold calculation that flashed across her face for just a split second before she rearranged her features back into that expression of wounded innocence that I now recognized as her default manipulation tool. "Honey, you're scaring me," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand with fingers that suddenly felt ice-cold against my skin. "I think the stress of taking care of me has been too much for you. Maybe you misunderstood what Dr. Richardson was trying to tell you. You know how overwhelming all this medical information can be." She was gaslighting me, trying to make me question my own sanity and what I had just heard with my own ears. This was the woman who had taught me to always tell the truth, who had grounded me for a week when I was 16 for lying about where I'd been on a Friday night, who had built her entire public persona around being honest, trustworthy, and morally upright. And she was sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by sympathy cards from people who genuinely cared about her well-being, trying to convince me that I was the one who was confused. That's when something inside me snapped, and I realized that I wasn't dealing with the loving mother who had raised me. I was dealing with a stranger who happened to share DNA with me, someone who was capable of manipulating not just me, but our entire community, for months without showing the slightest sign of conscience or remorse. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, something I had never thought I would need to do in a conversation with my own mother. "I'm going to call Dr. Richardson right now," I told her, my voice gaining strength with every word. "I'm going to put him on speakerphone, and he's going to tell you exactly what he told me. And then you're going to explain to me how you've been lying to everyone who loves you for the past 4 months. The mask finally slipped. The carefully constructed expression of confused innocence vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that I had never seen before on my mother's face. "You ungrateful little bitch," she hissed, her voice dropping to a tone that was more snake than human. "After everything I've done for you, after raising you by myself, after sacrificing my entire life for you, this is how you repay me? By calling me a liar? By trying to destroy the one thing that's brought meaning to my life in years?" The venom in her voice was so pure, so concentrated, that it felt like being slapped across the face. This was who she really was underneath all the performance, all the manipulation, all the carefully crafted image of the devoted mother and pillar of the community. The one thing that's brought meaning to your life? I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. You mean lying about having terminal cancer? You mean making me quit my job and move back here to take care of you? You mean taking $15,000 from people who can barely afford their own medical bills because they thought they were helping a dying woman? That's what's brought meaning to your life. As I spoke, I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation, how to manipulate me back into the role of the dutiful, guilty daughter who would do anything to avoid confronting her. But it was too late. I had seen behind the curtain, and there was no going back. I pressed send on the text message I had already typed to Dr. Richardson, asking him to call me immediately so he could speak directly to my mother about her treatment plan. As the message went through, I watched her face cycle through a range of emotions: anger, panic, resignation, and finally, a cold fury that told me I was about to discover just how far she was willing to go to maintain her elaborate fiction. The woman who had given birth to me, who had been the center of my world for 32 years, was about to become my enemy, and we both knew that only one of us would survive this confrontation with our relationship intact.